A millionaire gave $500 to a beggar to feed her child. The next morning, he found her at the grave of his beloved, who had died decades ago. Before the story, leave a comment below letting us know which city you're watching from. Enjoy the video. The night enveloped the city in a thick curtain of rain. Edward Johnson walked through the streets, covered with puddles that reflected the lights of windows and headlights, like tiny constellations on the wet surface. Raindrops slid down his face, mingling with the coldness he carried in his chest. Even though he wore his usual impeccable black suit, a sense of emptiness and desolation made each step feel heavier than the last. He had just left one of the city's most luxurious restaurants, where he had dined alone, as he had been doing for many years. This ritual repeated week after week, as if he were trapped in a cycle of nostalgia and bitterness, a silent penance he had imposed upon himself since the death of Charlotte, his wife, and the great love of his life. Time seemed to have stopped for Edward since he lost her. Although the world around him kept moving forward, he remained stagnant, living among the memories of a past that would never return. Somehow, he thought that by reliving those moments, he could keep Charlotte a little closer, even if only in his memories. However, that night, something would make him deviate from his usual path. While crossing an empty and dark square, a fragile silhouette caught his attention. Under the relentless rain, a young woman was huddled in a corner, holding a baby in her arms. She was trembling, her face hidden by the soaked hood of a thin, faded coat. Edward stopped, unable to look away. The sight of the woman and her baby, so vulnerable, stirred an uneasiness within him that he couldn't explain. After hesitating for a few seconds, he approached her. The woman raised her face, and her eyes, though tired, displayed a deep sadness, something Edward somehow identified with. He took a considerable amount from his wallet and extended it to her, indicating she should take it. She looked at the money, hesitant before accepting with a nod. "For you and your child. Use it to protect yourselves from the cold, to eat. Find a safe place," he said with the softest voice he could muster at that moment. She thanked him in an almost inaudible whisper, hugging the baby to her chest. Edward stood in silence for a few moments, staring at her, as if there was something he couldn't identify. Something about her touched him in a way no one had since Charlotte's passing. He walked away, resuming his path to his car, but as he drove, the image of the young mother and her baby continued to haunt him. He felt restless, as if he had left something important behind, something he couldn't explain. That night was different. As he lay down, the weight of loneliness seemed to gain a new shade of discomfort, and memories of Charlotte no longer brought the peace they used to. He turned in bed, but sleep did not come easily. When the sun finally broke through the clouds the next morning, Edward rose early, as he always did on Sundays, and drove to the cemetery. This was the only ritual that provided him with a type of serenity. He personally chose a bouquet of white flowers, Charlotte's favorites, and walked to her grave, where he spent long minutes in silence, conversing only with his memories. As he approached his beloved's resting place, Edward felt his body tense. There was someone there, kneeling beside the grave, with their head down and face covered by the same drenched hood he had seen the night before. It was the young mother. Even from afar, he could see she was crying. The scene, already impactful, seemed even more incomprehensible because it was Charlotte's grave. Edward watched for a moment, unsure how to react. Then, driven by a mix of curiosity and a strange sense of connection, he approached. The young woman raised her eyes and quickly wiped away her tears, as if she didn't want to be seen vulnerable. "May I ask what you're doing here?" Edward said, in a gentler tone than he had intended. She looked at him, and a profound anguish reflected in her eyes. "My mother. She is buried here," she replied in a weak voice. "I recently discovered that Charlotte is my biological mother." Edward's heart froze. He stared at the young woman, unable to say a word. Charlotte, a mother? He knew this couldn't be true. They had planned so much, dreamed of forming a family together, but they never got the chance. He believed he knew every detail of Charlotte's life, every secret. What this young woman was saying didn't make sense. Feeling a wave of conflicting emotions, Edward tried to regain control of himself. Charlotte, was your mother? He repeated, almost as if he were talking to himself. But how could that be possible? The young woman took a deep breath, her gaze now fixed on his. My name is Emily. I grew up with an adoptive family and only recently discovered the truth. I found a letter, something my biological mother left for me, saying who she was. I came here to meet her, to know who she was. Edward stepped back, feeling as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. A wave of sadness and confusion overwhelmed him. He had spent his life beside Charlotte, living for her memory, and now a woman emerged from the past with the revelation that Charlotte had a daughter he had never known existed. Words stuck in his throat, and he just watched her, his heart still racing, trying to understand what this meant. Edward spent the morning in a state of torpor, sitting in his living room, staring into nothingness as if the world around him had stopped. Emily's revelation that morning kept echoing in his mind. The young woman claimed to be the daughter of Charlotte, his wife, the woman he believed he knew inside and out, yet who seemed to have kept secrets so deep he could barely comprehend them. He looked at the photo of Charlotte on the living room wall, a picture of the two of them during a trip to Tuscany. It was one of the last happy moments they shared, and now it seemed like a symbol of an incomplete life, of something left unsaid. There was a sharp pain lodged in his chest, but also a gnawing doubt. How could Charlotte have hidden something so fundamental? He found it impossible to believe that someone who had shared so many dreams and promises with him could have lived with a secret like that. In the midst of this chaos of thoughts, Edward realized he needed to act. He got up, still hesitant but determined. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of Peter, his longtime lawyer and friend. Peter knew Edward better than anyone, perhaps the only person he trusted completely. When he heard the familiar voice on the other end of the line, Edward took a deep breath and decided to share what had happened. Peter, I need your help to investigate something about Charlotte. It's serious. Something I don't understand, and that's tearing me apart just thinking about it, Edward murmured, his voice still trembling with disbelief. Sensing the urgency in Edward's tone, Peter agreed without hesitation. Within an hour, he arrived at Edward's house and sat beside him, watching him with a look of concern. Tell me everything, Edward. You know I'm here for whatever you need. Edward then recounted his meeting with Emily and the words that still echoed in his mind like a disconcerting truth he could barely accept. Peter listened attentively, his face displaying expressions of surprise and doubt. I understand why this has shaken you so much. But we need evidence, Edward. She said she found a letter from Charlotte. Maybe we can start there. And if it's true, we need to understand why she kept it a secret, Peter advised, with the analytical gaze of someone anticipating a complex and twist-filled investigation. That's what's killing me, Peter. I can't understand it. And if she really is Charlotte's daughter, how could I have never known this? Edward replied, his voice shifting between anger and sadness. Peter nodded, recognizing the depth of his friend's distress. He suggested that they start by searching old records and documents that could give clues about Charlotte's last months. As Edward's lawyer, Peter already had access to many confidential files, but he knew that this investigation would require more than ordinary records. It would demand sensitivity to handle potentially devastating information. Throughout the afternoon, Peter and Edward examined old documents, hospital and financial records, trying to piece together a timeline of Charlotte's steps before her death. The initial findings were superficial, revealing little beyond the routines Edward was already familiar with. But then, among the files, a series of medical appointments caught Peter's attention. "Look at this, Edward. These are records of appointments at a private clinic you weren't aware of, right?" Peter pointed to a name that seemed almost forgotten, like a shadow hidden in the past. Edward nodded slightly. He didn't remember Charlotte mentioning that clinic or any reason to visit it. "I never knew she went to that clinic. Not even when she got sick did she mention anything like this. It's as if she had a secret life I never suspected," he said, his voice choked. Discovering that Charlotte might have kept secrets made him feel even more isolated, as if an invisible barrier had been erected between them, even after all this time. Peter suggested they visit the clinic to investigate further. If these records were genuine, they could reveal the mysterious consultations Charlotte had in the months before her death. Perhaps this would shed some light on Emily's story and what really happened before Charlotte disappeared. Edward agreed. They scheduled a visit for the following day, and although his heart was filled with doubts, he knew he needed to face this search for truth. Later, as he returned home, restlessness kept him from sleeping. He knew that uncovering Charlotte's past might bring things to light that he preferred not to know, but at the same time, he felt it was necessary to understand the woman he thought he knew completely. At dawn, Edward went to the cemetery again, with no purpose other than to try to feel Charlotte's presence once more. He stood before her grave, seeking answers in silence. "Why did you never tell me, Charlotte?" he whispered, as if she could hear. "I would have understood. I would have accepted any truth you wanted to share. Why leave me to live with this lie?" He remained there for long minutes, until a presence interrupted his thoughts. It was Emily, the young woman who had destabilized everything he believed about Charlotte. She looked at him with the same sad eyes she had the night before, but now with a shared sense of grief and understanding. "I just wanted to know who she was. I thought finding you here would help," Emily said, hesitant but with a sincerity Edward couldn't ignore. He didn't reply immediately. There was something about Emily, an essence familiar that made him feel uncomfortably close to her, as if he saw traces of Charlotte in this unknown young woman. He sighed and finally broke the silence. "I also want to understand what happened, Emily. If you really are her daughter, then perhaps we have answers to find together. I don't know what she told you or what you discovered, but I'll seek the truth. For myself, for her, and maybe for you too." Emily nodded, seemingly relieved by his promise. They parted with a brief exchange of glances and a nod, and Edward returned home, where Peter awaited to begin the formal investigation. Every new document they analyzed raised more questions about Charlotte's past. Edward felt he was on the brink of discovering a new side of the woman he had loved so dearly, and with that, he could find either peace or deepen his own sorrow. Above all, he knew he wouldn't rest until he knew the truth, a truth that perhaps was hidden in the shadows of the life Charlotte had led before him. Peter's office was filled with a heavy atmosphere as he and Edward reviewed piles of papers, old documents, and hospital records. Each new page Peter unfolded on the table increased the weight Edward felt, as if he were opening doors to parts of Charlotte's life he had never imagined existed. It took days of careful investigation for the image of a hidden past to begin to emerge. Among records of consultations and forms filled out in medical clinics, a name stood out, appearing in side notes on forms and in scheduling: Mason Evans. Edward remained silent, staring at that name, feeling an unexpected chill in his chest. Peter, noticing his friend's reaction, gave him a curious look. This name, Mason Evans, did he mean something to Charlotte? Peter asked, observing Edward's reaction. Edward hesitated before responding. He knew that name, but as a distant figure, someone Charlotte had mentioned only once. Mason was a shadow from her past, someone who, according to Charlotte, had been a brief friend in her youth, and who, in some way, had disappeared from her life long before she and Edward met. However, looking at the records, everything indicated that Mason had remained present, at least in part of her life. She mentioned that name once, but she said he was someone from the past. Nothing important, Edward replied, his voice laced with distrust. I never imagined he could have anything to do with this. Peter observed Edward closely, noticing the emotional turmoil this discovery caused. Deciding to dig deeper, he suggested they speak to people who had known Charlotte before the marriage. If Mason was indeed connected to Emily's birth and adoption, there were likely more details surrounding his name. Edward found himself forced to reopen old contacts, search through photo albums he hadn't looked at in a long time, and seek information he never imagined necessary. They found and contacted friends who had drifted apart over time, people who had been with Charlotte during a period he had considered distant and irrelevant. One of them was George, an old colleague of Charlotte's who had known her years before she married Edward. Meeting in a discreet cafe, George showed a look of surprise and reluctance when mentioning the name Mason Evans. After a few words exchanged, he finally began to speak, taking a long sip of coffee before revealing details. Charlotte and Mason were very close for a while. She trusted him a lot, George began in a low tone, as if the words were heavy on him. But there came a time something changed. She stopped talking about him and became very withdrawn, as if she were carrying a huge burden. We, her friends, noticed, but no one had the courage to ask what was happening. Edward felt his heart tighten upon hearing these words. Charlotte had been a warm-hearted and generous woman, but also someone who never fully shared her anxieties. George's revelations indicated that there was something dark in her relationship with Mason, something she preferred not to share with him. Do you know anything about her involvement with Mason in the last few months before our relationship? Edward asked, trying to keep his voice steady. I know he was around, George answered after a long pause. At the time, she started missing work, seemed worried, lost, and then she disappeared for a few days. When she returned, she was a different person. Those words brought a profound discomfort to Edward. The image he had of Charlotte, a woman of integrity and openness, now seemed to fragment into pieces, revealing a complexity he had never known. The investigation progressed, and Peter realized they might find more answers if they conducted a direct search for Mason's records. Cross-referencing Charlotte's hospital records with Mason's, evidence emerged that he frequented the same clinic as her. Mason, it seemed, was present at medical appointments Charlotte had, and this coincided with the dates of exams and procedures she had never mentioned to Edward. Each new discovery amplified the sense of betrayal and doubt within him. Not only did Charlotte seem to have hidden significant aspects of her life, but she had also trusted these secrets to a man he had barely heard of. Sitting in Peter's office, Edward ran his hands over his face, trying to process the revelations, but the bitterness in his heart only grew. How could she do this, Peter? If it was so serious, why would she leave me in the dark? Edward murmured, his voice frail and anguished. Peter, maintaining his pragmatic demeanor, placed a hand on Edward's shoulder and replied calmly, Perhaps she wanted to protect you from something she believed was better left in the past. But we're dealing with a part of her life that you didn't know, Edward. We need to understand more before judging. With this perspective, Edward decided to press on. He and Peter arranged a visit to the clinic where Charlotte and Mason had met to try to obtain medical records and delve deeper into what was happening during that time. The receptionist, after some resistance, released part of the old records upon realizing the seriousness of the investigation. And there, in the small clinic office, Edward found the confirmation of his worst fear. Among the doctor's notes and signatures of Mason and Charlotte, there was a form, an adoption request. Charlotte had indeed given birth to a child and, along with Mason, initiated an adoption process right after the birth. Edward looked at that paper as if it held a brutal truth, a betrayal he had never imagined possible. "There's no more doubt, Peter. She had a daughter, and hid it from me. She didn't tell me anything," Edward said, his voice breaking as if the weight of his words took his breath away. Peter, seeing Edward's state, tried to offer some comfort, though he knew that at that moment little could ease his friend's pain. "We'll find out more, Edward. Mason is the key to this story, and he likely knows all the details. We can try a direct approach with him," Peter suggested, cautiously but determinedly. Edward nodded, already decided. He knew he had to confront Mason to understand what really happened between him and Charlotte, and what drove her to keep such a secret. That night, as Edward prepared for the confrontation, he felt that his view of Charlotte was about to change forever. He had loved a woman of integrity and devotion, but now he was discovering that even the greatest loves could have unfathomable mysteries. Thus he took a deep breath, gathering strength to face a past he was determined to uncover. The clock read just past 6 in the evening when Edward found himself in front of the modest building where Mason Evans worked. Despite the place's unassuming appearance, Edward felt the tension of an imminent confrontation. As he entered Mason's office, each step seemed to echo with the weight of the secrets he had come to uncover. He kept his face expressionless, but inside, a powerful mix of fury and sorrow battled for control. Mason was seated at his desk, and upon seeing Edward, his expression shifted to a blend of surprise and caution. He knew Edward wasn't there by chance. "Edward, to what do I owe the honor?" Mason asked, his tone almost cynical, as if trying to maintain control over the situation. Edward wasted no time with pleasantries. He approached Mason's desk and, with a firm, resolved voice, demanded, "I know about Emily, Mason. I know Charlotte had a daughter, and that you were involved in it. I want to know why you helped Charlotte hide something like this from me." Mason sighed, visibly tense, but soon regained his composure, leaning back in his chair and clasping his hands over his desk. "I wondered when this day would come, Edward. I imagine it must have been difficult for you to hear about this, but I'll tell you the truth," Mason replied, his voice slightly bitter. "Charlotte was a young, confused girl when she got pregnant. She didn't feel ready to be a mother, and she thought that by giving Emily up for adoption, she was giving her a life she herself couldn't provide." Edward clenched his fists as he heard these words. His heart ached at the thought of Charlotte so vulnerable and lost that she would give up her own daughter. But what disturbed him most was the fact that she had kept this secret from him for all these years. "And why did she never tell me?" Edward asked, his voice bitter and disbelieving. "We spent years together. She knew I would have understood, that I would have accepted Emily." Mason looked at Edward with a mixture of understanding and resignation. "Charlotte loved you, Edward, and it was precisely because she loved you that she decided not to bring this story into your lives. I know it's hard for you to accept, but for her, it was a past she wanted to leave behind. She believed you both could start something new without the traumas of a complicated youth," Mason explained, his voice low but firm. Edward felt a wave of indignation wash over him. He couldn't fathom that Charlotte, the woman with whom he had shared so many dreams, would decide to leave him out of such an essential part of her life. His mind whirled with questions, but one in particular consumed him. "How did you get so involved in her decision?" "Why you?" Edward asked, a mixture of anger and distrust in his voice. Mason shifted uncomfortably in his chair and looked away, as if reluctant to answer that question. But, under Edward's persistent gaze, he finally responded. "Charlotte and I, we were close, long before she met you. I was there when she found out about the pregnancy, and even though we weren't a couple, I felt I should help her. So I organized the adoption process. The decision was hers, Edward, but I supported her when she needed it." The coldness in Mason's voice only amplified Edward's sense of betrayal. He wondered how Charlotte could have turned to Mason for such a difficult choice. Instead of seeking the support he believed would have been enough for both of them. He felt desolate, as if the memory of the love they shared was transforming into a shadow of what he thought it had been. "And do you really believe that was best for her? Do you really think hiding this story was what she needed?" Edward questioned, his tone laced with bitterness. Mason took a deep breath, his face reflecting a blend of remorse and conviction. "I believe so. Charlotte was young. She was lost. And the past with Emily was something she didn't want to relive. She wanted to move forward with you, Edward. I'm not justifying her choice, only saying it was something she needed, a way to start over." Edward fell silent for a moment, feeling the weight of the revelation. He couldn't simply erase what he had just heard, nor could he change the past, but something still bothered him. He knew there was more to the story, more that Mason was withholding, and he was not going to give up until he discovered everything. "I don't know if I can accept this," Edward said, more to himself than to Mason. "One thing is her past, another is hiding a daughter. She didn't have the right to decide this alone." Mason nodded slowly, as if he had anticipated that response from Edward. "Charlotte was a complex woman, Edward. But I know she loved you more than anything. If she had felt it was possible to share this with you, maybe she would have. But all I can say is that the decision was hers." Edward felt his chest tighten, as if Mason's words were blades cutting deeply. The woman he had loved so devotedly now seemed distant, wrapped in a web of secrets he had never imagined, and while part of him wanted to understand, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been deceived. Without another word, Edward rose, leaving Mason alone with his own thoughts. The anger still pulsed through his veins, but a new determination began to grow within him. He knew he needed to continue investigating, to dig even deeper into Charlotte's secrets. There was something about Mason that didn't feel genuine, a hesitation he couldn't ignore. Back in his car, Edward allowed himself a few moments of silence, trying to process everything he had heard. The image of Charlotte was now intertwined with shadows he didn't want to admit, but couldn't escape. He felt that the woman he had loved had never fully been his, that there had always been a part of her kept hidden, inaccessible. When he called Peter to inform him of the meeting, Edward spoke with a resolve he barely recognized in himself. "We need to keep going, Peter. I can't stop here. Mason revealed some things, but I'm sure he's still hiding something. I want to understand everything, down to the last detail," he said, his voice bitter and determined. Peter agreed without hesitation. Their partnership continued, with Edward now more determined than ever to uncover every piece of the enigma that was Charlotte. Edward watched the night through his office window, lost in somber thoughts as he processed each new discovery about Charlotte's past. The revelation that she had a daughter was disturbing enough on its own, but now the suspicion arose that Mason Evans might have been directly involved in the decisions Charlotte made in her last months, perhaps even in her death. Anxiety gnawed at Edward, but he knew he needed to stay focused. Peter was by his side, organizing documents and notes, preparing for another stage of that painful investigation. At dawn, Edward and Peter reviewed the documents from the clinic and the information gathered after the confrontation with Mason. That's when they noticed a disturbing pattern. In every document, Mason's presence seemed increasingly intrusive. Not only had he organized Emily's adoption process, but he had also made decisions on Charlotte's behalf, influencing each step. "Look at this, Edward," Peter said, pointing to a medical consent form. Mason signed this authorization for exams as if he were Charlotte's legal guardian. That alone seems suspicious. Edward leaned in to look more closely. He felt a mix of anger and disappointment seeing that Mason, even after Emily's birth, had remained in Charlotte's life in a way that went beyond what he had called support. Mason's presence was more invasive than Edward had imagined. It was as if he had become an omnipresent figure, someone who controlled decisions Charlotte should have made herself. Edward's mind spun with this new perception. Something was clearly wrong in the way Mason had acted, something that didn't fit with the story he had told during their confrontation. Instead, it seemed Mason had used Charlotte's vulnerability to manipulate her choices. With every new page they reviewed, Edward began to see Mason as something else. Not a support, but a manipulator. Peter, sensing Edward's growing frustration, suggested they talk to some of Charlotte's old colleagues to find out any clues about Mason's influence on her life. Among these contacts, they found Lauren, a friend of Charlotte from the time she had attended prenatal appointments. Lauren remembered that period well and agreed to meet with them to clarify some questions. In the meeting, Edward and Peter listened to Lauren describe how Charlotte had appeared deeply distressed, especially in the months following Emily's birth. She also mentioned that Mason was always around, insisting on accompanying Charlotte to every appointment. "He was almost obsessive," Lauren recalled, frowning. "He seemed more worried about the secrecy than about her well-being. I remember Charlotte saying that Mason had strong ideas about what was best for her, as if he was the only one who could decide for her." Edward felt a chill as he heard that. Charlotte had always been an independent woman, someone who wasn't easily influenced. For Mason to have had such control over her, he must have manipulated her feelings during a time of great vulnerability. Returning to Peter's office, Peter raised a point that had been in Edward's mind since the beginning of the investigation: the accident that had taken Charlotte's life. That tragic event had always been a painful point, but Edward had never imagined it could be entangled in a plot so dark. He knew that if there was a chance Mason was somehow linked to the accident, he had to confront this possibility, no matter how painful it was. "We can't ignore this line of investigation, Edward," Peter stated with a firm tone. "We need to review the details of that accident. If Mason indeed tried to hide something about Emily, he may have gone further than we thought." Driven by this terrible suspicion, Peter and Edward delved into the records of Charlotte's accident. After hours poring over police reports and interviews from the time, they found evidence that set off all the alarms. The report indicated that shortly before the accident, Charlotte was seen arguing with someone on a street near where her car skidded and crashed. The witness's description was vague, but suggested that the man present at the scene could have been Mason. Edward felt a wave of nausea at the thought that Charlotte's death might not have been a mere accident, but the result of a conflict involving someone who claimed to act in her interest. He knew he needed to protect Emily from that man, but more than that, he felt he owed Charlotte an answer, a truth that she herself perhaps never found. Peter agreed to reach out to the authorities to reopen the investigation, as with the new evidence, there were sufficient suspicions to justify a fresh examination of the case. Edward knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was resolved to get to the bottom of this story, even if it meant facing painful memories and confronting a betrayal he had never imagined. As Edward and Peter continued their investigation, they gathered more information on Mason and his involvement in Charlotte's life. They came across an unsettling discovery: records from the maintenance shop where Charlotte's car had been serviced shortly before her accident. These records showed that Mason had taken her car in for service, specifically requesting an adjustment to the brakes. The mechanic's notes indicated that Mason had asked for a peculiar adjustment rather than a replacement, something out of the ordinary that hadn't raised alarm at the time. Upon hearing this, Edward felt a controlled fury building within him. Every piece of the puzzle seemed to confirm his worst fears. Mason, who had always claimed to act in Charlotte's best interests, had in fact orchestrated a sinister path of obsession and control. Armed with this final piece of evidence, Edward and Peter decided to confront Mason once more, this time with the support of law enforcement. The anger and determination Edward felt were palpable as he prepared to face the man who had brought so much pain and betrayal into his life. At Mason's office, Edward wasted no time in revealing what they had discovered. "Mason, we know what you did," Edward said, his voice icy and controlled. "You sabotaged Charlotte's car, causing the accident that took her life. Why? Why all this hatred?" Mason, realizing he had been cornered, initially looked away as if he felt shame. But then he lifted his gaze, his eyes taking on a strange bitterness. "Charlotte was the only good thing in my life, Edward," he began, his voice tinged with desperation. "When she got pregnant, I thought we would finally share something meaningful. I wanted her to choose me, but she distanced herself and gave up her daughter. And then you appeared, taking everything I believed was rightfully mine." Edward felt a wave of revulsion wash over him. Mason's words made it clear that he viewed Charlotte not as a person, but as an object to be possessed, someone whose choices didn't matter. Worse, Mason had extended his obsessive control to include Emily, hoping to exert power over even the next generation. "You took her life because of your own obsession," Edward spat out, his tone heavy with contempt. "And now you tried to approach her daughter to continue this twisted cycle. How could you be so blind?" Mason hesitated, then spoke, finally confessing. He admitted that he had tampered with the car's brakes, hoping it would serve as a lesson to Charlotte, thinking it would somehow bring her back to him. But instead, it had ended her life. His confession was enough for Edward and Peter to call the police, who arrested Mason on the spot. As he was led away, Mason looked back at Edward and Peter with an expression of bitter defeat. Afterward, Edward felt a tremendous weight lift from his shoulders, though the pain of losing Charlotte remained. He knew, however, that he had finally obtained the justice she deserved, and that Mason would no longer cast a shadow over anyone's life. The news of Mason's arrest brought Edward and Emily a mix of relief and sadness. United in mourning and in the search for justice, they had brought the dark past into the light and, in doing so, found a new connection. In the weeks that followed, Edward dedicated himself to supporting Emily and her son, providing them with stability and comfort, a way of honoring Charlotte's memory by offering the love and support she never got to give. Gradually, the mistrust that had initially existed between Edward and Emily began to dissipate. Edward realized that by helping Emily and her son, he was not only assisting a new generation, but also filling the emptiness that Charlotte had left. He didn't see Emily as a replacement for his lost love, but as a chance to transform his grief into something greater, a promise of hope and continuity. "Thank you, Edward," Emily said one afternoon as they watched her son play. "For everything, for your support, and for helping us uncover the truth." Edward nodded, sensing that her words were a closure to a painful chapter. He smiled at Emily, a serene expression that, until that moment, he had thought impossible. "We both lost so much, Emily, but we have a chance to make something of it, to honor what Charlotte left us." Edward invited Emily and her son to live with him in his mansion, which now felt too large and silent. She accepted gratefully, and little by little, the place came alive with the laughter of Charlotte's grandson echoing through the halls. Though Edward was neither Emily's biological father nor her son's grandfather, he felt a duty to keep Charlotte's memory alive, building a new family alongside them. It was a way of honoring the love he had known and turning the pain of the past into a hopeful future. And so Edward and Emily, together, embraced this new beginning, a promise of rebuilding and a life where truth and love would prevail. They knew the journey to heal the past would be long and difficult, but they also knew that by supporting each other, they could finally find peace. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.